A casino supervisor just broke their silence about dealer techniques that are specifically designed to influence your betting decisions. What industry insiders are revealing about these 8 psychological tactics could completely change how you approach the casino floor. And gambling establishments definitely don't want this information getting out. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how dealers manipulate your decisions without you even realizing it, and why the psychology behind these techniques is more powerful than you ever imagined. Before we dive in, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe and tell me in the comments about a time when you felt pressured to bet more than you planned at a casino table. Let's start with something that seems completely innocent, but is actually a carefully orchestrated psychological technique. Dealers are trained to complement your play at very specific moments, and it's not because they genuinely think you're making smart decisions. Industry veterans explain that dealers learn to recognize when a player is about to color up their chips and leave the table. Maybe you've had a small winning session and you're thinking about cashing out. That's when the dealer will suddenly say something like, "You've been playing really smart tonight," or "You've got great instincts for this game." The compliment serves multiple purposes. First, it makes you feel validated and confident. Second, it creates a social obligation. The dealer just said something nice to you, and leaving immediately after feels rude. Third, and most importantly, it reinforces the idea that you're skilled at the game, which makes you more likely to keep playing because skilled players should keep winning, right? One supervisor from a major Vegas casino reported observing a blackjack dealer who was particularly skilled at this technique. The dealer would watch players carefully and could predict with remarkable accuracy when someone was about to leave. At that exact moment, the dealer would say something like, "Wow, you really know when to hit and when to stay. That's rare." The supervisor tracked one particular player over the course of an evening. The man had won about $300 over 2 hours of play. He stacked his chips 3 separate times, clearly intending to leave. Each time, the dealer complimented his strategy or decision-making. Each time, the player sat back down and continued playing. By the end of the night, that player had given back all $300 plus another $200 from his pocket. The dealer's compliments had kept him at the table for an additional 3 hours beyond when he first intended to leave. The casino made $500 from a player who should have walked away a winner. What makes this technique particularly effective is that it doesn't feel like manipulation. The compliment seems genuine and spontaneous. Players have no idea they're being influenced by a tactic that dealers practice and refine over years of working the floor. Supervisors report that the best dealers can increase table hold by 15 to 20% just through strategic compliments and friendly conversation timed perfectly to keep players engaged. The dealers aren't doing anything technically wrong. They're just being friendly at calculated moments. And that friendliness is worth thousands of dollars per shift to the casino. This technique is so subtle that most players never consciously notice it's happening. But once you understand it, you'll see it at almost every table game in every casino. Watch a craps table or roulette wheel, and you'll notice that dealers have a very specific way of addressing players who make minimum bets. They'll say things like, "Minimum bet is $10," or "We're at a $15 table," even when the player clearly knows this information and has been betting that amount all night. Industry insiders explain that this isn't about informing the player of the table minimum. It's about making them feel self-conscious about betting small. The statement draws attention to the fact that the player is betting the absolute minimum, which can feel cheap or timid, especially if other players at the table are betting larger amounts. The psychological impact is that many players will increase their bet to avoid feeling like they're being called out for being a small bettor. They'll bump their $10 bet to $15 or $20, not because they wanted to, but because the dealer's helpful reminder made them feel uncomfortable about their bet size. One supervisor from Atlantic City described a roulette dealer who had mastered this technique. The dealer would say, "Minimum bet is $5" in a neutral tone, but would then follow up winning bets with enthusiastic congratulations, but only for players betting above the minimum. Players betting the minimum would just get a simple chip push with no comment. The contrast was obvious to anyone paying attention. Bigger bettors got enthusiasm and engagement. Minimum bettors got efficiency and silence. Within an hour at that dealer's table, nearly every player had increased their base bet to get some of that positive interaction. The supervisor estimated that this dealer increased average bet size at their table by 30% compared to other dealers working the same game. Over a full shift, that translated to thousands of dollars in additional revenue for the casino, all because players wanted to feel included in the dealer's enthusiasm. What's particularly manipulative about this technique is that it exploits social dynamics. Humans are social creatures who want to fit in and be acknowledged. By making minimum bettors feel invisible or less valued, dealers create a financial incentive for players to bet more just to receive basic social recognition. Experienced supervisors report that this tactic works especially well on men playing in front of dates or friends. The social pressure of being identified as the person betting the minimum is often too much to bear, and they'll increase their bet significantly just to avoid that stigma. Dealers are trained to show sympathy when you lose, but that sympathy serves a very specific purpose that has nothing to do with genuine concern for your well-being. When you lose a hand or spin, a skilled dealer will make a sympathetic face, maybe shake their head slightly, and say something like, "Oh, that was so close," or "Man, that's tough luck." This seems like normal human empathy, but it's actually a calculated move to keep you betting. Industry veterans explain that the false sympathy serves two critical functions. First, it reinforces the idea that your loss was due to bad luck rather than mathematical probability. If it's just bad luck, then your luck could change at any moment, so you should keep playing. Second, the sympathy creates a bond between you and the dealer, making you less likely to walk away because you'd be abandoning someone who seems to care about your experience. One supervisor from a tribal casino in California reported training new dealers on exactly how to deploy sympathy at the right moments. The training included specific phrases, facial expressions, and timing. New dealers would practice in mock table scenarios until their sympathetic responses looked natural and sincere. The supervisor described watching a dealer use this technique on a middle-aged woman playing blackjack. The woman had lost 7 hands in a row, and with each loss, the dealer's sympathy became more pronounced. "That's so frustrating," the dealer said. "You're playing perfectly. It's just not falling your way tonight." The supervisor knew from the player tracking data that this woman had lost over $1,200 that evening. The mathematically correct advice would have been to stop playing, but the dealer's sympathy was telling a different story. The dealer was validating that the woman was playing well and just experiencing temporary bad luck. The woman played for another 90 minutes and lost an additional $800. When she finally left, the dealer maintained the sympathetic expression and said, "I really hope it turns around for you next time." The woman actually thanked the dealer for being so understanding. What makes this technique particularly effective is that it prevents players from accurately assessing their situation. When you lose, your rational brain might say, "I should stop, I'm down too much money." But the dealer's sympathy tells you, "This isn't your fault, it's just bad luck. Keep going, and it'll turn around." Supervisors report that dealers who master false sympathy can extend player sessions by 30 to 50% compared to dealers who remain neutral. Those extra minutes and hours at the table translate directly into more money lost and more profit for the casino. The worst part is that some dealers aren't even being deliberately manipulative. They've been so thoroughly trained in these sympathy responses that they genuinely believe they're being helpful and supportive. They don't realize they're enabling destructive gambling behavior by constantly reinforcing the narrative that losses are temporary bad luck rather than mathematical inevitability. This is one of the most psychologically manipulative techniques dealers use, and it works on almost everyone, regardless of how experienced they are with gambling. When you win a bet, dealers are trained to amplify the celebration in a way that makes the win feel bigger and more significant than it actually is. They'll clap, smile broadly, say, "Nice hit," or "Great win," with genuine sounding enthusiasm, and generally make a production out of your victory. Here's the manipulation. Dealers amplify celebration most enthusiastically when you win back less money than you've lost. If you've been betting $25 a hand for an hour and losing steadily, and then you win one hand, the dealer will celebrate that single win as if you just hit a jackpot. But mathematically, you're still down hundreds of dollars. Casino supervisors explain that celebration amplification serves multiple purposes. It creates a positive, emotional peak that your brain will remember more vividly than the slow, grinding losses. It encourages you to keep betting because winning feels so good, and the dealer's enthusiasm makes you feel like a successful gambler. And it distorts your perception of how the session is actually going. One supervisor from Reno described a craps dealer who was legendary for celebration amplification. When a player hit a point number, this dealer would cheer, high-five other players at the table, and create an electric atmosphere that made everyone feel like they were winning big. The supervisor analyzed the table hold data and found something remarkable. At this dealer's table, players stayed an average of 45 minutes longer than at other craps tables. The longer playing time translated to significantly higher losses, despite the fact that players left feeling like they'd had a great time. One particular case involved a bachelor party that spent 3 hours at this dealer's craps table. The dealer celebrated every single win with massive enthusiasm. The group was laughing, cheering, and having an incredible time. They felt like they were crushing it. When the group finally left, the supervisor checked their total buy-in versus cash out. The 8 guys in the bachelor party had collectively lost nearly $6,000, but they were all smiling and talking about what an amazing night they'd had. The dealer's celebration amplification had completely masked the financial reality of their session. What makes this technique so effective is that it hijacks your brain's reward system. Your brain releases dopamine when you win, but it releases even more when that win is accompanied by social celebration. The dealer's enthusiasm literally makes your brain feel better about winning, which creates a powerful incentive to keep playing to experience that feeling again. Supervisors report that the best dealers know exactly how to modulate their celebration based on bet size. If you're betting black chips, $100, they'll celebrate every win significantly. If you're betting red chips, $5, they'll still celebrate, but with slightly less enthusiasm. This creates a subtle pressure to bet more to receive more enthusiastic celebration. Some casinos even train dealers to use specific celebration phrases that include the player's name. "Nice hit, Michael," is more psychologically powerful than just "nice hit" because it personalizes the celebration and strengthens the social bond between dealer and player. The celebration amplification technique is particularly dangerous because it makes losing sessions feel like winning sessions. Players walk away having lost money but feeling good about the experience, which means they're likely to come back and lose more money in the future. This is a technique that operates almost entirely below conscious awareness, but it has a massive impact on how much money players lose. Skilled dealers know how to manipulate the pace of the game to maximize casino profit. They'll deal quickly when you're losing and slow down slightly when you're winning. The speed difference is subtle, maybe just a few seconds per hand, but over the course of a session, it makes a significant difference. Industry insiders explain that dealing quickly when a player is losing serves two purposes. First, it gets through the losing streak faster, which psychologically feels less painful than losing the same amount over a longer period. Second, it means more hands per hour, which means more total money wagered, which means more profit for the casino given the house edge on every hand. When a player starts winning, dealers will subtly slow the pace. They'll take a moment longer to shuffle. They'll engage in a bit more conversation. They'll carefully restack chips. This serves to make winning streaks feel longer and more significant than they actually are, while reducing the number of hands played per hour during the period when the house isn't profiting as much. One supervisor from a major Las Vegas Strip casino described timing dealers at blackjack tables over multiple shifts. The average dealer dealt about 70 hands per hour at a moderately busy table. But when the supervisor analyzed the data more carefully, they found that dealers averaged 85 hands per hour when the table was collectively losing and only 60 hands per hour when players were collectively winning. The supervisor interviewed several dealers about this pattern. Most weren't consciously aware they were doing it. It had become such an ingrained habit that the speed manipulation happened automatically based on whether chips were moving toward the dealer or toward the players. One dealer admitted that they had been explicitly trained to use conversation strategically. If players were winning, the dealer was encouraged to chat and engage, which naturally slowed the game. If players were losing, the dealer was told to focus on efficiency and keep the cards moving. The supervisor shared a specific example of a high roller playing blackjack at $100 per hand. Over a 4-hour session, the player experienced significant swings. During the 2 hours when the player was losing, the dealer averaged 90 hands per hour. During the 2 hours when the player was winning, the dealer averaged 55 hands per hour. The result was that the player played through many more hands during losing periods than winning periods. Even though the session might have felt relatively balanced in terms of wins and losses, the sheer volume difference meant the player lost significantly more money than they would have if the pace had been consistent. What makes this technique particularly insidious is that it's nearly impossible for players to detect. You're not consciously tracking how many seconds each hand takes. You just feel like the game has a natural rhythm, not realizing that rhythm is being carefully manipulated to maximize your losses. Some dealers have taken this technique even further. They'll slow down dramatically when a player hits a blackjack or wins a double down, really letting that win sink in and feel significant. But they'll speed through normal wins as if they're routine. This creates a psychological environment where big wins feel frequent and meaningful, while the steady stream of losses just feels like the normal flow of the game. Supervisors report that dealers who master pace manipulation can increase table hold by 10 to 15% without players ever realizing anything unusual is happening. That percentage might not sound huge, but across hundreds of tables and thousands of players, it translates to millions of dollars in additional casino profit every year. This technique exploits one of the most fundamental flaws in human thinking: our tendency to see patterns where none exist. Dealers are trained to make comments that suggest patterns in random outcomes. At a roulette table, a dealer might say, red has hit 5 times in a row. That's unusual. At a blackjack table, they might comment, the shoe has been dealer-friendly today. At craps, they might observe, we haven't seen a 7 in a while. These observations seem like neutral commentary, but they're actually planting suggestions that influence betting behavior. When a dealer points out that red has hit 5 times in a row, players immediately start thinking about whether black is due or whether red is hot. Both thought patterns lead to increased betting. Casino supervisors explain that these pattern comments work because they validate the gambler's fallacy, which is the mistaken belief that past random events influence future random events. In reality, if red has hit 5 times in a row on a fair roulette wheel, the probability of red or black on the next spin is exactly the same as it always is. But humans desperately want to believe they can predict what's coming next. One supervisor from Mississippi described a roulette dealer who used pattern recognition comments constantly. Every 15 minutes or so, the dealer would make an observation about streaks, gaps, or unusual patterns in the outcomes. The dealer wasn't saying, you should bet on black now, but the implication was clear. The supervisor tracked betting behavior at this dealer's table versus other roulette tables in the casino. Players at this dealer's table increased their bet size by an average of 40% after the dealer made a pattern observation. They were trying to capitalize on or bet against whatever pattern the dealer had pointed out. One specific case involved a retiree who had been betting $5 on red and black fairly randomly. The dealer commented, "We've seen a lot of odd numbers today, more than I usually see." The player immediately shifted to betting $15 on odd numbers, convinced that the pattern would continue. Over the next hour, the player lost steadily because odd and even continued to appear randomly, as they always do. But the player kept betting on odd because the dealer's comment had convinced them there was a genuine pattern. By the time the player left, they'd lost over $400 chasing a pattern that existed only in their imagination. What makes this technique especially manipulative is that dealers can never be wrong. If they comment that red is hot and it keeps hitting, they look knowledgeable. If it stops hitting, well, streaks always end eventually. If they comment that a 7 is due at craps and it doesn't come, they can just shrug and say, "That's gambling for you." There's no accountability for planting false pattern recognition in players' minds. Supervisors report that some dealers use pattern comments strategically on specific types of players. Analytical players who seem to be thinking carefully about their bets are prime targets because they're the most likely to latch onto pattern observations and try to exploit them with larger bets. One supervisor mentioned that they had to counsel a dealer about making pattern observations too frequently. The dealer was technically doing nothing wrong, but the supervisor felt the technique crossed an ethical line. The dealer's response was telling, "I'm just making conversation about what I'm seeing. If players choose to bet based on that, that's their decision." Technically, the dealer was right, but the supervisor knew the dealer was deliberately manipulating player behavior through implied pattern recognition. The casino chose not to stop the practice because it was so profitable. The implied pattern recognition technique is particularly dangerous for players who are already prone to magical thinking or who believe they have a system for beating casino games. The dealer's pattern comments validate their approach and encourage them to bet more aggressively on fundamentally random outcomes. This technique creates psychological pressure to bet more quickly and with less consideration, and it's remarkably effective at increasing both bet frequency and bet size. Dealers are trained to create a sense of urgency at specific moments. They might say, "Last chance for bets," with a slightly rushed tone, even when there's plenty of time. They might move through betting rounds quickly, making players feel like they need to decide immediately or miss their opportunity. They might comment on how hot a table is, implying that players need to get in on the action right now before the opportunity passes. Industry veterans explain that manufactured urgency bypasses rational decision-making. When you feel rushed, you rely on instinct and emotion rather than careful calculation. This leads to larger bets, more frequent bets, and chasing losses more aggressively. One supervisor from a Connecticut casino described a craps dealer who had perfected manufactured urgency. The dealer would call out, "Shooter's on a roll, get your bets down," with an excited, urgent tone that made players feel like they had to bet immediately or miss out on guaranteed wins. The supervisor watched one evening as this dealer worked a crowded craps table. Every time a shooter made even 2 or 3 point numbers, the dealer would ramp up the urgency. Players started frantically placing additional bets, increasing their existing bets, and generally betting far more aggressively than they had been moments before. One player at that table had been carefully betting $10 on the pass line with single odds. After the dealer started creating urgency around a hot shooter, that player increased to $25 pass line bets with maximum odds and added several prop bets. The shooter 7'd out 3 rolls later, and the player lost nearly $200 in under 2 minutes. The supervisor reviewed the tape afterward and realized the shooter hadn't actually been particularly hot. They'd made 2 points, which is completely normal. But the dealer's urgent commentary had created the illusion of an exceptional situation that players needed to exploit immediately. What makes manufactured urgency so effective is that it triggers fear of missing out. Players don't want to be the person who didn't bet when the table was winning. They don't want to look back later and think, "I should have pressed my bets when I had the chance." So they act quickly without considering whether the situation actually warrants increased risk. Another supervisor from Nevada described watching a blackjack dealer use urgency to push players into insurance bets. When the dealer showed an ace, instead of calmly offering insurance, the dealer would say quickly, "Insurance? Insurance? Going once," creating artificial time pressure that made players throw chips out for insurance without thinking about the math. Insurance bets have a significant house edge, and educated players know to decline them. But when pressured to decide in 2 seconds, many players make the insurance bet just to avoid feeling like they missed an opportunity to protect their hand. Over the course of a shift, those rushed insurance decisions add up to substantial additional casino profit. One particularly manipulative use of manufactured urgency involves dealers commenting on time-based jackpots or progressive meters. A dealer might say, "That jackpot's getting really high. Someone's gonna hit it soon," creating urgency around a payout that's entirely random and not actually due to hit at any particular time. Supervisors report that dealers who effectively create manufactured urgency can increase betting volume at their tables by 20 to 30% compared to dealers who maintain a more measured, calm pace. That increased volume translates directly into increased player losses and increased casino profit. What's particularly troubling about this technique is that it can push players into making financially destructive decisions in seconds. Someone who sat down planning to bet conservatively can find themselves making wild, desperate bets within minutes because the dealer created an environment of urgency that overrode their better judgment. This is the most sophisticated and potentially most harmful technique dealers use, and supervisors say it's responsible for more extended losing sessions and larger losses than any other tactic. Dealers are trained to learn player names, remember their preferences, and build genuine-seeming relationships over multiple sessions. This personalization seems friendly and customer service-oriented, but it serves a calculated purpose. It makes players feel obligated to stay at the table and continue betting even when they should quit. Industry insiders explain that personalized enablement works on multiple psychological levels. First, there's the social obligation aspect. If a dealer knows your name, remembers that you like a particular drink, and asks about your family, walking away from that table feels like abandoning a friend. Second, there's the validation aspect. The dealer's attention makes you feel important and valued, and you maintain that feeling by continuing to give the casino your business. Third, there's the reciprocity aspect. The dealer is being nice to you, so you feel obligated to keep betting and potentially even tipping more. One supervisor from a major Vegas property described a dealer who had been with the casino for over 20 years. This dealer knew hundreds of regular players by name, remembered details about their lives, and maintained relationships that felt genuinely personal. The supervisor considered this dealer one of their most valuable employees. The supervisor accessed player tracking data for people who regularly played at this dealer's table versus other dealers in the casino. The results were striking. Players at this dealer's table stayed an average of 90 minutes longer per session and bet approximately 30% more than they did at other tables. One specific case involved a regular player named Robert who visited the casino every Friday evening. He always played at this particular dealer's blackjack table. The dealer knew Robert's kids' names, knew where he worked, knew his favorite sports teams. Their conversations felt like two friends catching up. The supervisor reviewed Robert's play patterns over a full year. On evenings when this dealer wasn't working, Robert played for an average of 2 hours and lost an average of $300. On evenings when this dealer was working, Robert played for an average of 4 hours and lost an average of $700. The difference was entirely attributable to the personal relationship. Robert didn't want to leave because that would mean ending his conversation with the dealer. He'd start stacking his chips to cash out, and the dealer would ask about his son's baseball season, and Robert would sit back down and keep playing. Over that 1-year period, the supervisor estimated that the personal relationship between the dealer and Robert cost Robert approximately $20,000 more than he would have lost playing with impersonal dealers. But Robert likely viewed the dealer as a friend and would have been shocked to realize how much that friendship was actually costing him. What makes personalized enablement particularly insidious is that it often appears to be the opposite of manipulation. The dealer seems to genuinely care about you. They remember your stories, ask follow-up questions, and treat you like a valued person rather than just another gambler. This makes it nearly impossible for players to recognize they're being manipulated. Another supervisor from New Jersey described having to have a difficult conversation with a dealer about boundaries. The dealer had become friends on social media with several regular players and was having conversations with them outside the casino. The supervisor explained that while this seemed innocent, it created relationships that made it even harder for players to set healthy limits on their gambling. One of those players had confided in the dealer about financial stress at home. The dealer expressed sympathy and support. But then that same player came to the casino and sat at the dealer's table and continued losing money they couldn't afford to lose. The dealer dealt the cards with a friendly smile and never suggested the player should probably stop gambling. The personal relationship had created a situation where enabling destructive behavior seemed like normal friendship. Supervisors report that dealers who master personalized enablement are extremely valuable to casinos. These dealers create customer loyalty, extend player sessions, and increase betting volume through relationships that feel personal and authentic. The fact that these relationships are also costing players enormous amounts of money is simply considered part of the business. What's most troubling about this technique is that many dealers probably don't think of themselves as manipulative. They genuinely like many of their regular players. They enjoy the conversations and relationships. They've simply been trained to deploy those relationships in ways that benefit the casino financially, and they've internalized that training so thoroughly that it feels natural. The personalized enablement technique is particularly effective on lonely individuals who may not have many close personal relationships outside the casino. The dealer's attention and apparent friendship fills an emotional need, and players will spend staggering amounts of money to maintain access to that relationship. One supervisor shared a heartbreaking example of an elderly widow who played at the same dealer's table 3 afternoons per week. The dealer was kind, attentive, and made the woman feel valued and important. Over the course of 2 years, that woman lost her entire savings, approximately $180,000, largely because she couldn't bring herself to stop visiting the dealer who had become her primary social connection. So now you know all 8 dealer tricks that casino insiders use to manipulate your betting behavior. The calculated compliments that keep you at the table. The bet reminders that make you feel self-conscious about small wagers. The false sympathy that prevents you from accurately assessing your losses. The celebration amplification that distorts your perception of how you're actually doing. The strategic deal speed that maximizes your losses during losing streaks. The implied pattern recognition that makes you chase randomness. The manufactured urgency that bypasses rational decision-making. And the personalized enablement that makes you feel obligated to keep betting. Understanding these techniques won't make you immune to them. They're designed to operate below conscious awareness and exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology. But awareness is the first step toward protecting yourself. The most important thing to remember is this: dealers are not your friends. They may be friendly, they may be enjoyable to talk to, and they may genuinely be kind people. But their job is to keep you at the table betting as much as possible for as long as possible. Every technique they use, every conversation they have, every smile and joke and sympathetic gesture exists within that professional context. Set strict limits before you sit down. Decide exactly how much you're willing to lose and stick to that number regardless of how friendly the dealer is, how close you feel to a pattern, or how urgently you feel you need to bet. Never gamble with money you can't afford to lose. And remember that the house edge is always working against you, no matter how skilled or lucky you feel. The casino environment is carefully engineered to separate you from your money as efficiently as possible. Dealers are one part of that engineering. They're trained professionals using sophisticated psychological techniques refined over decades of research into human behavior. Knowing this doesn't make you safe from manipulation, but it does give you a fighting chance at making rational decisions despite the constant pressure to bet more. Subscribe for more insider casino information they don't want you to know.